we good to go? All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Olivia Enos, a senior fellow here at Hudson, and it is my delight to be able to welcome you all, for those who are in person, to the Hudson stage, and for those who are online, thank you for joining as well. Today, we are discussing a topic worthy of the world's attention. We're going to be discussing the plight of the Uyghur people. The CCP, of course, is carrying out what we now know is a genocidal campaign designed to eliminate both current and future generations of Uyghurs. One essential component of that is the CCP's policy of enslaving the Uyghur people. And we know from the incredible research of Adrian Zenz that the CCP today runs the largest state-run forced labor scheme in the world. And as of 2024, there are at least 3 million Uyghurs that are currently subject to various forms of forced labor. In the face of such massive challenges, the world truly had no option but to act. And that's why an incredible feat was achieved when the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or the UFLPA, was passed. Its most notable feature is a rebuttable presumption designed to stop goods produced with Uyghur forced labor from entering U.S. markets. That law is now coming up on its 2-year anniversary of full enforcement. And as such, I produced a paper that you all actually should have received on your way. And if you didn't, feel free to grab it on the way out. It's called Strengthening Implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The paper itself identifies a handful of both opportunities and challenges to the law's implementation, and it also lays out 13 different recommendations on how to strengthen both the U.S. and global efforts to counter the CCP's continued enslavement of Uyghurs. I don't want to spoil the entire paper, but my favorite part of it is definitely the recommendations section. And so I did just want to very quickly tease a couple of different ideas that I think are very important from the paper. And these ideas are things that I see as complementary to or strengthening the UFLPA, not in place of it. For one thing, I talked about the rebuttable presumption, which assumes that goods that are produced by Uyghurs are produced with forced labor. This is an incredible and an essential element of the UFLPA, but I believe that importers who are repeat offenders continuing to import goods produced with forced labor should face higher penalties in the form of fines and potential forfeiture, financial consequences for continuing to use and to import goods that are produced with Uyghur forced labor. And my second recommendation is to take the fines or the profits that otherwise would have been made and put them into a fund for Uyghur survivors of the ongoing atrocities. This is perhaps my favorite recommendation because I think this recommendation has the potential to say, yep, importers are doing something wrong, the CCP is doing something wrong by enslaving the Uyghur people, but we can give them some sort of opportunity to have help and assistance after having already survived the genocide. A couple of other recommendations is that I think we need to target aiders and abettors of Uyghur forced labor by creating secondary sanctions authorities that expand U.S. authorities to go after those who are continuing to help perpetuate Uyghur forced labor. And we also need to strengthen coordination with allies and partners to make sure that they're also implementing laws similar to the UFLPA in their own contexts so that goods produced with Uyghur forced labor just are not only not entering U.S. markets, but also not entering other markets, especially freedom-loving markets around the globe. There are several other recommendations in the paper that I think are worthy of attention, but I'll leave it at that for now. And now to the main event. I'm so excited because of the composition of this panel, to be honest. We have one individual who was an architect of the UFLPA and the legislation. We have one who is an implementer and living out what the UFLPA is intended to do. And then we have another panelist who is a member of the private sector and also was previously an implementer. And so it's just really incredible to have this broad swath of expertise represented on a single panel. But before we start, I think we have an incredibly important panelist who unfortunately couldn't be here in person today. Her name is Kalbanur Ghani, and she is a Uyghur woman living here in Northern Virginia. Her sister, Ranagul Ghani, is actually subject to forced labor in Xinjiang right now. And I think for me, I really wanted to start off this panel with a focus on the why the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act matters, why it matters that we get US and broader efforts right when it comes to countering forced labor, and the why is the Uyghur people, those who are enslaved today. And so we're now going to play a video. It's about 10 minutes, and I just wanted to say very quickly that this was incredibly sacrificial of Kalbanur to even make this video. She is about to go into labor with twins, literally, and I think she's either had them last night or had them today, and she filmed this video for us. But I think this is a testament to how important it is to her to see her sister find freedom in the future, and I'm so excited for you guys to hear from her now. So we'll go ahead and cue up the video.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Kalbanur Ghani. Firstly, thank you so much for the Hudson Institute and Miss Olivia to organizing this event, also giving me this opportunity to speak about Uyghur forced labor through by my sister case. Thanks everyone to participating in this event, also listening our story in here. I am Kalbanur, currently living in Virginia, Northern Virginia, which is in the Fairfax. My sister Ranagul Ghani, she was a teacher, art teacher and literature teacher when she was detained to mass concentration camp by Chinese government in 2018. She had 2 degrees, art and literature. And when she was detained, there wasn't any excuses given to my family, or there wasn't any trial for the first few years. And here is my sister photo. This is my sister photo, and she was born 1981. And she had 2 sons, and she was teacher, and she was eldest in our family. And this is her Chinese ID. And this is her youngest son. And this is what I had from the latest photos. And this is my last photo with my sister when I was visit my home in 2016 during the school holiday. And she was detained to this mass concentration camp in our local county, which is called in Chinese Qimuxian, re-education camp in Uyghur language, or in English called Cherchen County Re-education Center by officials. And she stayed in here from 2018 August to until 2021 May. I got to my sister detention actually the information in 2019. Since on actually I started giving testimonies to media, social media, media like Washington Post, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and New York Times. And also I started to campaign in my social media, like Twitter account, Facebook, including Instagram. This 5 years journey since 2019 wasn't easy. Since I started to speak up, I had gone through so many threatened messages from the Chinese government, like directly and indirectly. Directly is like they call my WeChat, because that's the only the tools that I could contact with my family. And indirectly, it's like they always visit my mom, threat her, harass her, and then always ask her to speak to me, to silence me. They threaten me like they threatened me use my mom and my sister. Once they told me, your sister in our hand, your mom is you in our hand. If you don't listen to us, if you don't delete your testimony videos from the Twitter, you will never ever gonna see your sister alive, or you will never see your mom alive. I received such kind of a lot of threat messages since 2019 until last year, because I given a testimony to Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, and also given those national Chinese national security officers long messages, voice messages, and video calls to them. And also the Congress made Congress is passed the bill about the Chinese, especially the that bill name is like transnational repression, against the transnational repression, like for Uyghurs or Hong Kongers or Tibetans. So since on that threat was like lesser, but didn't stop until now. And about my sister, after she stayed in here 3 years, since 2018 to 2021, they transferred her to the Changji Second Women's Prison, which is location is, this is the Chinese name, sorry, I didn't translate to the English yet. The calls in English, Changji Second Women's Prison. This is I got from the Chinese officials where she was transferred. Before than that, they told me that if I listen to them, if I keep silent, they will release her. I kept silence like 6 months, but instead of she released, but she transferred to this biggest, one of the biggest prison in the Uyghur region. And later on, like I tried to search about this Chinese, this Changji Second Women's Prison, and I found out in this prison address there is another clothing factory registered under this address. And also I heard from my family since like last year, I guess, they allowed to my sister to like speak like 5 minutes every month, like in video calls. So she told our family, I am making dress every day. So if one day, if I able to out of this prison, I will make you pretty dress. So, and this is what I found, that clothing factory address is registered under the prison, and my sister is making clothes. This is really unacceptable. Since 2019, I am seeking help. Not only me, thousands of Uyghurs like me, we giving testimonies, we speaking up, we protesting against the Chinese silent genocide towards the Uyghurs. And now Chinese government just like transferring our loved ones, our brothers, sisters, our parents from mass concentration camp to the prison, and using them as a slave labor every day, and profiting from them like by selling these goods to free world like United States or Europe. And I hope first from the God, and then second after the God, I still hopeful from the democratic country like United States. I hope politicians will take some actual and some strong action against the Uyghur genocide, the silent Uyghur genocide, and then against the Uyghur forced labor. Chinese government didn't change anything, just they transferring our loved ones from mass concentration camps to the forced labor prison, using them as a slave labor, and then making money, and then sentencing them to long, very long sentence. My sister, sorry, I forgot to mention another key point is my sister was after the transfer to prison, they sentenced her to 17 years, 7 years for the praying at our father funeral, and additional 10 years for the keeping a religious book. This was informed our family verbally. There's no any trial or there wasn't given any black white paper. So I still urge people in the free world, please take action, real action, toughest action against the Chinese government to stop this disgusting Uyghur forced labor and the silent Uyghur genocide. Thank you so much for everyone, and thank you so much for listening on the time and joining this event again. Have a good day.
When Kalbiner and I were speaking last night ahead of the event, when she said to me, sorry, is my mic on?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. When she said to me, my sister is making dresses in the factory, and she said, one day when I come out, I would like to be able to make beautiful dresses for you. I can't imagine having a family member tell me something like that. I just found that truly gutting. I know that Kalbiner is a hard act to follow for everyone else, and I'm so grateful to her for having recorded that video for us. But I know you guys are all up to the task. So Scott, I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of you in the order that you'll speak. Scott Flipsy is the Director of Policy and Media Relations at the Congressional Executive Commission on China. Prior to joining the CECC, you were with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where Scott served as Deputy Director for Policy and managed the Commission's East Asia programs. His previous experience includes Associate Director and Adjunct Professor at the University of Notre Dame's Washington semester and Legislative Assistant for I think everybody loves Frank Wolf. He's done a lot for human rights over the years. Flipsy holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame and is specializing in that specializes in U.S. foreign policy in Asia. And then we have joining us Eric Choi. Eric serves as the Executive Director for Trade Remedy and Law Enforcement in the Office of Trade at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, where he's responsible for threat assessment units, special investigations, and enforcement programs focused on detecting, deterring, and disrupting illicit trade, with a special emphasis on forced labor violations, evasion of special tariff cases, and civil penalties. Previously, Eric served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade at the Department of Homeland Security. And let's see here. And Eric joined the Department of Homeland Security in 2016, where he led the chemical sector-specific agency in the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Prior to that, he served for 23 years in the United States Army. Thank you for your service. And he received his Master's of Arts from the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and a Master's of Business Administration from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Last but not least, we have John Pickle joining us. He is the Senior Director of International Supply Chain Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. John sets the strategic direction and executes efforts to promote efficient, resilient, and stable supply chains. And this includes advancing a number of different policy priorities, including those focused on human and labor rights issues. John previously served as the Principal Director of Trade and Economic Competitiveness at the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans, where he was a primary trade and supply chain policy advisor to agency leadership. And even prior to joining DHS, John served in various roles at CBP for over a decade. John is a graduate of the George Washington University. He has a BA in political science from there. So without further ado, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Olivia.
Yeah.
It's also good to be with these guys because usually I'm busting them on a Zoom call about implementation of UFLPA, but it's good to see them here, dressed well, and sort of we're pulling in the same direction. It is a hard job to go after that video. Wasn't going to do this, but I'll tell a quick story. A certain undersecretary at DHS, Rob Silvers, before the last meeting that we had, came up to me, early on and said, "How are we doing? Tell us how we're doing. Tell us, are we doing a good job?" Right? Does this a lot, right? But he wanted to sort of get feedback from me that you guys were doing a good job in implementing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and I said to him, "Mr. Undersecretary, I'm not the guy you need to ask that question of, right? Because I'm not a cool policy wonk interested in sort of trade issues and the sort of implementation sort of work that you're doing. I have to do that. My motivation is rage. Rage that something like that happens, right? Rage that could happen to human rights lawyers." And I said, "So you can't do enough. You cannot stop enough. You cannot do enough to sort of until something like that stops." And it's important to remember, as you said, that there's a human stories behind this, victims, people with extreme vulnerabilities who are exploited for their labor in the Uyghur region. And that, to me, is what we have to remember as we're talking about implementation. It's stopping the genocide. I think when President Biden signed the bill into law, and I'm paraphrasing this, I believe he said something along the lines of we've been interested in forced labor and the sort of imbalances in our trade relationship that forced labor has, but that has caused over the last 20 years. But we're also going after the funding of genocide, right? And so, in a sense, forced labor, people are profiting from genocide, and someone like myself who is motivated in such a way to stop that this is the tool we have. I mean, there's other tools, you've talked about it, there's other tools that we have that are also in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but this is the sort of primary one at this point in time. And I think it's important, even as we sort of celebrate this signal achievement, right? And it is a signal achievement, to remember that behind it is a human tragedy. And I wrote down one thing to sort of say today, and it's that even as we celebrate and sort of work on implementation on this bill, we have to remember that it shouldn't have been written at all. It shouldn't have to happen. It sucks. It's terrible, right? I wish we didn't have to do it. But the reality is that we have, and so we need to sort of implement it in such a way that it is effective, that it does the job that it's supposed to do, and that it captures the companies that continue to profit from genocide and crimes against humanity. I was given the task of talking about the history of the bill. I think that that may not be of specific interest here, because I think we want to talk about the present and implementation and maybe the future, and I'd be happy to talk about those things in the Q&A afterwards. But I also I want to go over some things quickly in terms of the history, because it's extraordinary that this legislation even passed. it's extraordinary from the PNTR vote in 2001 to 2021 when this bill is signed that something like this is even done, right? And what forces, political and global, had to happen to do that. Haley Bird-Wilt from the Dispatch did a pretty good, if you want to read her 5 stories in the Dispatch, I think it's still available online. I mean, she sort of talked to all of the folks that were involved in terms of how the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act gets passed. And I want to stress the fact that in November of 2021, the White House told Uyghur leaders that the bill was not going to pass, was not going to pass. Sorry, move on. We'll do other things. We have other tools. We can do other things, through our authorities at Treasury and through DHS, but it wasn't going to pass. And so some extraordinary things had to happen in that time period, to get things done. And I think for me, one of the seminal moments, again, this is how the bill got over the final hurdle, was Josh Rogan's piece in the Washington Post, when sort of Senator Merkley, who one of the heroes here, right, from Oregon, who's the chair of the CECC at the time, sort of admitted that he was being lobbied by the White House to sort of push back on the bill, to pull it, to not. And he said, yes, I've been lobbied, and I have pushed back. We can do both. We can work on the environment issues and we can work on forced labor, and I'm pushing for moving this. And he came forward and he went on record, and I think it opened a dam. Sort of New York Times started asking, then Speaker Pelosi, were you being lobbied? And she said, yes, I've been lobbied, and I pushed back. And so, and things became partisan as sort of Senator Marco Rubio, held up the NDAA. Or he was going to hold up judicial nominations or other nominations, right? And so things become partisan. The labor groups, went to the White House and said, "Hey, this is our ask." Right, in December, they went and said, "This is our. It's been on our list, but now it's our top ask. This needs to get done." So there was political things that were happening, at that last minute, to sort of move this forward. One thing that isn't reported that's sort of interesting is that at the last minute, a version of the bill was being circulated as one that was going to pass the Senate, and it did not have the rebuttable presumption in it. The text, it was gone, and there was. I know there were groups, because I was engaged with them over these times. Who wanted that part out, and that they also had a version of the bill that they wanted, which was just to have the entity listing and the strategy, and no rebuttable presumption. And so I don't know how that happened, how these things were passing, but it's like Todd Stein, who was then he was the Mr. McGovern, Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, deputy staff director of the CECC. He caught that first. And so we were like sort of starting to find out how it happened and things like this. And so it was moving forward without the rebuttable presumption at the last minute until some of it's version control, some of it's the fact that we were moving quickly to pass this bill. But it's a little known sort of last minute snafu that had to happen over a weekend where we had to stamp our feet and say this is going to happen. But some of the other things that in terms of, again, when I wrote the very first memo laying out the idea for this bill, everyone who I sent it to said this is not possible. It's impossible to do. The business community, a lot of people, including myself, maybe Kelly as well, had PTSD from our sort of work in 2001 about the WTO, the PNTR vote, and thought that the business community would come in and sort of squelch this idea. And so, I do think that there's a lot of things that happened at the time, but I think two sort of more closer historical events. One is the end of the engagement theory, the sort of notion that trade and liberalization would lead to liberalization of the Chinese Communist Party. The business community was no longer the gatekeeper of sort of U.S.-China policy as it once was. The election of President Trump and the sort of bringing into positions, you got Miles, you got Kelly. There's people that, because I think we were in an entrepreneurial phase about how U.S.-China policy would work, with the engagement theory sort of falling apart, rightfully so. What was going to be our position, how we were going to act with this new and more confident economically, more stable politically, more aggressive internationally, more repressive domestically Chinese Communist Party. And so there was an entrepreneurial phase where Congress and sort of people in the administration were sort of throwing ideas up against the wall, sort of moving things. And there were lots of partners, whether it's in State Department or Commerce Department on export controls or at the White House. I was invited, to internal interagency sort of meetings with CBP and DHS on Xinjiang, right? After 2018, El Nagar put those together from the NSC. And so there was a lot of people who were thinking in an entrepreneurial way about how we're going to address U.S.-China relations. How are we going to sort of address genocide and human rights abuses, particularly in the Uyghur region. And so I think that's one thing where that changed from 2001. The other one is Nancy Pelosi becoming Speaker of the House of Representatives in 2018, right? She has a profile on China issues. I think she was interested in her legacy, if she's watching. She was interested in her legacy, and I mean, she's another hero here in a sense because she promised to push these bills and to sort of make sure that her committee chairs fell in line. When Coca-Cola talked to us, when their lobbyists, well, it actually wasn't the lobbyists, Coca-Cola's government affairs people, talked to us about the bill in opposition to it. I mean, they made the point of saying, well, none of your members are on the Ways and Means Committee. None of your members are on the Finance Committee in the Senate. So you're not going to move this bill, right? It's like you don't have the. We're going to talk to those people because those are our usual interlocutors. But I think, but the speaker at the time sort of moved these bills to the top of her caucus and made sure that they, got their hearing through regular order, but that the people who wanted to stop it weren't allowed to sort of muck around with the bill and its language. So I mean, I think that. So I mean, we also can't. I mean, the other thing that's different here is certainly Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping's China. Not that I think he's such a big break with the CCP, and in his way of dealing with domestic repression, but I mean the confidence with which he pursued not only international aggression but the repression that has gone on. I see Sophie Lowe back there, and human rights lawyers were my first sort of project in China. And there's a picture of me in 2009 in Beijing with a group of human rights lawyers. Actually, Liu Xiaobo was in the photo. If you know the Nobel Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, he showed up at this dinner, and he's in the corner right before he was put in prison in 2009. But there were other people here: Pu Zhisheng, Teng Biao. Gao Zhisheng was on. Li Baiguang was sitting next to me. Li Hoping Li Chaofu was behind. I mean, the best and the brightest of human rights lawyers in China. And I look at that picture now and I go, dead under suspicious circumstance, dead in police custody, tortured. A 40-year-old man looks like a 65-year-old man after torture for every day for 2 years. Another lost psychotic break. Others who aren't who are also tortured and in exile. And sort of, I think of this and I think they systematically sort of took out the best and the brightest of the legal minds in China just because they were using Chinese law to hold the government accountable. And so I think, so it's not a far-fetched for me that they would sort of be sort of engaged in genocide, right? When you see the stuff that's come out about likening Uyghurs to weeds or to bugs, and to stamp them out, I mean it's not a far-fetched. So again, this is a bit of the history. It's a bit of my motivation, and I think it sort of puts the human element behind this, and to sort of give you a sense of what types of things had to happen for a bill like this to sort of pass, because nobody thought that it would. And so now we move into the next phase, which is doesn't have these type of stories, but these type of stories are everything that has to be thought of when we take action under this bill. So again, I'll talk about the present and the future and what I think I'd like to work on and what I'm working on now. But I'd like to turn it over to Eric and John for.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you also, I appreciate you highlighting some of the watershed moments, because I think for those who were not in the trenches at the time, it can be easy for those things to fade from our recent memory. And I think one of the really neat things about the UFLPA is that it was such a bipartisan initiative, and I hope that that serves as an inspiration for folks who are thinking about doing human rights work in the future, that working in a bipartisan way, working with even maybe uncommon bedfellows in order to get things done is often what's necessary. And I think that's a common thread for many of the important pieces of legislation that have made it into law today. So I appreciate you reminding us on that. Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great, and thanks for those insights, Scott. I remember those days leading up to when, just before the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was signed, especially from a department and agency executive branch perspective, thinking that, having been through the year prior, seeing several markups and see several versions, but then kind of on the eve of Christmas in the New Year's holiday, I'm just thinking, there's this massive push, all these different back and forths going, and all the different red markups and edits and things that are missing, and all of a sudden, things that are being added in. But it's just amazing that it was passed and then quickly moved. And certainly it goes back to the prominence and the importance of the issue. And I think everyone that really is involved, everyone that's here on the stage and everyone's in the audience, I think for a law like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to be successful really takes a whole of community, society effort, whether it's from our legislative branch to give that forge that path and that legal foundation for the operational to enforce, but then also those that are in the trade and industry to uphold and do the due diligence in their supply chains and make those hard decisions to move away from where those gross human rights abuses are occurring, like they are in the Xinjiang region of China, to all of us as consumers, to be knowledgeable and wary consumers with regards to things that we're purchasing and who we're buying them from. So certainly from the agency's perspective, our path really kind of starts from 2016 with the repeal of the consumptive demand and the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act, which really kind of set us on the path, unbound the agency to really start enforcing strongly our nation's laws with regards to goods being produced with forced labor from entering into the commerce of the United States. And so, from that moment on, we really moved quickly to ramp up our own enforcement program, investigative program, and capabilities to look at where forced labor is prominent and existent within our supply chains, and then that led us to where we started becoming knowledgeable of the gross human rights abuses that were occurring in the Xinjiang region of China, working together with the interagency, also doing our own investigations, which led to our own withhold release orders, which is our enforcement action to stop the importation of goods that are linked to forced labor, against the XPCC, the specific commodities that are like cotton and tomato products that are being principally produced and exported out of the Xinjiang region, to working with the federal interagency to develop and a business advisory for business to say, hey, there are these gross human rights abuses. Our colleagues in the Department of State, through the Secretary of State, also made this the declaration that this is genocide, which also put the issue front and foremost, but also let us be able to communicate that to business that this is not some place that we should be doing business with. And so as we go into this kind of evolution for the agency and our enforcement of the what you call Section 1307 under the Tariff Act, or the prohibition of goods produced with forced labor, that has really kind of fundamentally changed the agency, who has traditionally been an agency that is the largest second revenue producer for the U.S. government through trade and commerce, preserving and protecting the U.S. economy and maintaining economic competitiveness through trade. So maintaining that smooth facilitation of lawful and legal trade coming through our 328 ports of entry across the United States, enforcing nearly 500 laws on behalf of 49 partner departments and agencies at our ports of entry that really we're focused on the protection of revenue for the nation. And so as we moved into focusing in on these ethical and human rights issues, and looking at these issues within our supply chain, really fundamentally changed the focus of and expanded our scope of enforcement within CBP. So, which led us to our new agency strategy that not only is focused on the facilitation of trade and the enforcement of trade, but also in assuring sustainable and ethical trade. And also in the sustainable and ethical trade space is one, to really to uphold kind of our nation's core fundamental American values with regards to human rights, but then also to promote fair competition for domestic industry, increase economic opportunities for home, and then also doing those things that reduce our dependence on foreign goods overseas. But then also where we see kind of these gross atrocities, these violations occurring, really focusing in on where we can most aggressively pursue those networks, those unfair trade practices that are being conducted by state actors, by criminal networks, as well as other criminal actors that are looking to get a leg up or make more money in the trade facilitation space. So when the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, certainly from the agency's perspective, from our commissioner, we already had full support with regards to moving forward, really pressing hard. Making forced labor has become one of the most pressing issues that we're engaging as an agency currently. And so not only from the commissioner, but also through Secretary Maorkas, through Undersecretary Silvers that you had mentioned, had spoken to, where Secretary Maorkas had made public pronouncements and private pronouncements to all of us that were working there at the time, saying that we're going to enforce this to our max capabilities. We're going to enforce these laws, whether under Section 307 or under the UFLPA, because we are not going to consume goods on the backs of forced labor, right? And that not only is the problem of forced labor globally around the world, but also for the goods that are being produced by Uyghur and ethnic minorities that are being persecuted in the PRC, and those goods that are coming to the United States. And then, through Undersecretary Silvers, who put out the strong messaging that when we implement the UFLPA, it's going to be, I'm sure you probably heard, if you've been watching, I'm sure you've heard it, we're going to be speedy, surgical, and strong, right? And that's kind of the banner by which we have been moving forward quickly and strongly and surgically throughout the past couple of years. So we got the UFLPA that was passed. We didn't have a long glide path to implement the UFLPA. Thanks, Scott. But again, with the priority, not only priority from Congress, but also full support from at the time from the White House and from across the executive branch. We had interagency members, we had folks from across the department, from the agency, really step up to implement, come up with the plan and implement the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, But then the next phase was operationalizing it. And certainly hasn't been without bumps. And it's still, even at a 2-year point, we're still learning and we're still growing and still relatively nascent in the sense that, when you look at the law with regards to forced labor under Section 307, that it says that we enforce whole or in part. So it's not necessarily, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act amplifies Section 307 and is founded upon 307, that it's not only those goods that are being produced in the Xinjiang region of China, it's anything that is produced, that enters into the supply chain, and any good that enters into the commerce of the United States that leverages those inputs from the Xinjiang region of China, or where those Uyghurs or ethnic minorities are transferred as part of the poverty alleviation program. So they could be transferred elsewhere into China, produce stuff that enters into the supply chain, into downstream manufacturing process, and then ultimately into goods that we consume here in the United States. And that's been the largest challenge, right? In the sense that, from a straight importation and trade perspective, to see where goods originate from an export to a direct importation. I think we fairly are confident that we are able to capture anything that comes directly from the Xinjiang region, but things that take the inputs of goods, and if you look at most of what is occurring within the Xinjiang region, you don't necessarily get a whole lot of finished goods that are coming out of the Xinjiang region. You know that China is investing in heavy industries, dirty industries in the Xinjiang region, and it's at that production and base, tier 3, maybe tier 2 level of manufacturing that goes into downstream manufacturing processes that are. We've also seen kind of the shift in where a lot of the downstream manufacturing that's owned and connected back to Chinese companies have been nearshored or offshored from China, whether it's into third countries that surround, whether in Southeast Asia, into north of China, also into South Asia, but then also other companies broadly around the world that are taking these inputs and entering these inputs into their manufacturing process. So that is the challenge. And so if you look kind of in the broad globalization of things, you kind of think of the forced labor and the gross human atrocities that are occurring is kind of like this metastasized cancer, right? And so in order to treat that, you got to go and find where that cancer has spread to, and target and pinpoint enforcement. And that's the approach that we have to take with regards to the downstream manufacturing. Is so, we look at those risks, we look at those companies that are operating, but also, and we look at who they're connected to, where the supply chains are going, and ultimately, to those importations that are coming to the United States. And again, the U.S. is not the only market as well, since the China and those supply chains supply the world as well. So, with that, we have. Really work closely with industry. We work closely with our legislative partners as well. Again, it's kind of a whole of from the executive to legislative to industry, working together to really effect and make an effective approach to implementation of the UFLPA. We've had significant amount of engagements with all stakeholders, whether it's with civil society, with media, those that are strongly want more enforcement, to those that want controlled and limited enforcement, to you name it, right? So that's kind of the agency's thing. We're always kind of put in the middle of all the various stakeholders, but we've been committed to not only enforce strong, but also maintain the most transparency we can as a law enforcement agency. With regards to enforcement within the laws and the legal boundaries that we have to sharing information. So we've had significant amount of engagement. We've leveraged kind of the resources that Congress gave us to be able to, one, increase our capacity to look at those supply chains at our ports of entry, also within our centers and our threat analysis centers that are now across the country that are looking at these supply chains, looking at specific commodities, looking at specific companies, and identifying those specific importations coming in. We built laboratory capabilities that can leverage scientific testing and maximize the outreach and the communications that we're doing with all stakeholders to be able to share information to meet everyone where they're at. And then just the last and foremost, I mean, we've seen, I think it's just amazing over the last couple of years, just with regards to the shift in conversation. I think in past engagements have kind of, with certain stakeholders, I've kind of related this back to kind of the stages of grief, especially if you're, either from a regulator or just from an enforcement perspective, those that are being regulated or enforced against, go through kind of these stages of grief. But now we've gotten to the point where it's no longer denial, no longer pushback. I mean, you still get some of that, but it's now it's entered into the mainstream conversation. How do I comply? Or what do I need to do? We've seen a significant industry version in this space that's helping industry get a better picture of their supply chain, a better understanding of who is in their tier, within their tier 2 and tier 3s of their supply chain, where industry traditionally, especially over the last several decades, haven't had to do that. It's just more of just kind of the rapid expansion and go for the best costs and cost savings and quality. We've seen a significant amount. We've seen where companies have had to make very difficult decisions, especially with very established supply chains, where there has been very public reporting, and those companies that are leaning forward, looking at not only the government's enforcement and what the government is sharing, but also leaning on investigative media, civil society think tanks that are putting information out there, because ultimately the reputational risks and costs and the monetary costs to potentially getting stuff stopped are high risks for companies. And then lastly, just the global conversation from like-minded partners around the world certainly has driven a lot of change and engagement with our international partners from the very beginning. A lot of our engagement with the international partners really kind of centered around countries that had companies that were being enforced against, and those countries advocating for their countries. But now it's countries coming on board saying, we don't agree with this too. We don't agree with these gross atrocities. We want those public pronouncements. And we've seen recently in the EU, who now is not only within our North American corridor under USMCA, with Canada and Mexico, who we're working closely with to move forward with our combined commitments under USMCA, but also the most recent passage of the forced labor regulation within the EU. And so, we're excited in the year to come, or in the next couple of years, since there is a longer glide path to implement that. But we're excited in the years to come, engaging with our international partners. One, to maximize kind of the effects of our enforcement, so we have like-minded enforcement, but also making sure that when it comes to compliance, that we can harmonize our compliance and approach and requirements for industry as well. So with that, I'll end there.
That's great. Thank you, Eric. And I think it's great to hear that countering forced labor is such a high priority for CBP and the broader efforts. And I know, at least for me, it's always helpful to have a reminder of how the rebuttable presumption works in practice, because I think a lot of times we think about, it's only from the Xinjiang region, but no, it's also the forced labor transfer programs as well. And that is no easy task. And I imagine quite the game of whack-a-mole to try to identify all of those challenges. So very appreciative of the work that you and your team do.
Excellent. Well, I have the unenviable task of going last after these two gentlemen were able to cover the ground so thoroughly. So a couple of points just to add on to what Scott and Eric had said about some of the challenges, right, associated with implementing the UFLPA that we're now 2 years into, which is just seems like it's gone very quickly. But one, I wanted to highlight just the significant level of commitment at both the agency level at DHS across the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force that I observed in my time when I was in government, and certainly within Customs and Border Protection. Everybody who cares about this issue should have a lot of confidence in the fact that Eric and his team and CBP leadership, as well as DHS leadership, are extremely committed to very faithful implementation of this statute. Since that phase of implementing the UFLPA at the department level, I've thought quite a bit about how we overcame some of the challenges in terms of herding the cats in the interagency through the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. Very willing cats, but with very different agency equities, as well as different areas of responsibility and different processes to bring them together, to actually put together a strategy that gets updated every year. It will have a new iteration, hopefully, based on the statutory deadline later this month, but also to implement things that these organizations hadn't done before, right? The rebuttable presumption wasn't new, but it hadn't been implemented at the scale that was being required by the UFLPA. It was applied specifically to products made by North Korean nationals, right? So now to apply it broadly to a human rights context, right, is a very different paradigm than how that had been applied in reality in the past, right, as a practical matter. So, understanding all of those challenges and how we're able to move forward and meet every one of those statutory deadlines that Eric mentioned were a very short runway, 30, 60 days, 6 months to put out the initial strategy, including all of the interagency review and all of the hoops you have to jump through there, was not easy to come by. But I think looking at what's transpired since then. Eric mentioned that there's been a significant amount of engagement with industry, and I think that one of the lasting legacies of the UFLPA is really going to be the elevation of visibility into specific human rights concerns as industry structures their supply chains, develops their sourcing mechanisms, how they interact with the government to be able to take on board information that is actually going to help inform how to decrease their own risk as they're looking at this. What was really impressed upon me in my time at DHS and now again in the private sector is that industry is a very willing participant, right? They're eager to partner with the government to not only identify risk and actually do something actionable with that information in terms of structuring supply chains, but also sharing information both ways that can be used to augment enforcement in this area that will actually move the needle on preventing the use of forced labor. I think I'll try to be brief just to leave time for question and answer, but I think as we look forward, there are some opportunities. There are areas of the UFLPA that have not yet been fully realized. The UFLPA requires a diplomatic strategy that has not been made publicly available, that in theory should outline risks that industry can understand and take into account as a risk indicator when they're structuring their supply chains. There's also been a forced labor and trade strategy that USTR has been developing for several years now. The comment period closed, I think, 2 years next month, if I remember correctly. So these are processes that are sort of in train that really get at a broader idea of what is the most effective means of actually getting at the root cause of forced labor. Border enforcement is a necessary backstop, as it is in all manner of trade law enforcement. As a primary means of enforcing a prohibition on forced labor, relying on a border measure to kind of carry the heavy load, so to speak, puts a lot of pressure on our supply chains, and the enforcement only occurs after the forced labor has occurred. So it's somewhat counterproductive in that regard. So what we would very much like to work closely across the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, because this does not fall squarely on DHS or CBP, but is to really look at how to address those root causes of forced labor and share that information that the government is generating to better inform risk assessment so that supply chains can be structured in a way that tainted goods don't have that high of a risk of actually entering the supply chains. There's been a significant amount of progress in that regard, and there may even be some statutory hurdles that need to be overcome that we can address going forward. However, I think that those are significant goals in terms of moving that needle on how these efforts are going to be used to actually change the trend in terms of the use of forced labor. I'll just say also, kind of going back to my observations from government and now in the private sector about the prioritization of forced labor compliance and having significant visibility. Eric mentioned some of the industries that have popped up around ensuring compliance. So whether we talk about traceability or isotopic testing, or the use of creative uses of blockchain or distributed ledger, or whatever the different tools are, I think another important kind of paradigm to keep in mind here is that CBP certainly, but also in terms of law enforcement generally, when we're talking about federal law enforcement, is very much a risk-based dynamic, right? So as we enter conversations in a paradigm where hopefully more information can be shared between the government and the private sector, identifying the areas of highest risk and being able to deploy those resources directly at those perceived risk areas is really the most effective way to approach those scenarios. There's been some significant conversation I'd say in the public realm, where there's been insinuation that sort of end-to-end supply chain visibility should be the goal for every product coming to the United States. Supply chain due diligence is important. However, as we're looking at applying visibility, traceability, testing capabilities that are very expensive to scale at this point, really focusing those on the nodes of supply chains that are the highest risk. Is at least a bridge strategy, but probably a more efficient way to identify compliance and due diligence going forward, which is what we are all after, right? I'll speak for myself, but others may agree or disagree. But I would, I think the other part of this is fishing where the fish are, right? Identifying where in what types of shipments there is that higher risk also applies to the government, and limiting to the extent that there's the ability to identify that risk. What areas how we're labeling what the risk vectors are, whether it's by industry, by entry type. As an example, de minimis entries under $800 have been talked about as a significant pathway for forced labor items. De minimis purely means that you don't pay duty on a product. So there's no change to de minimis policy that is somehow going to result in the government being able to say, there was a box on a form check that said this was made using forced labor, or a harmonized tariff schedule number that leads to duty calculations that will indicate if a product was made using forced labor. So looking out for some of those issues that are not necessarily directly tied to forced labor risk, and how to kind of put them in the appropriate place. So I think, just in conclusion, wanted to thank Olivia and thank the Hudson Institute for having this event and for drafting this paper, and very much look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Sure. I think it's really helpful to end on a note where you're considering the range of different opportunities for future implementation, and hopefully it gets all of our juices flowing as we think about potential questions to ask. So with that, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative. I'm going to ask the first question, but for those in the audience, please do gear up your questions. I'm going to ask you to give your name, your affiliation, and please, please, please ask a question. I told the guys in advance that I'm a notorious moderator. I will cut you off if you start a monologue. So, but my question to you all is, throughout our conversation, we have been talking through what can be done when it comes to countering Uyghur forced labor. But I wanted to drill down a little bit further and just say, if there's one thing that the U.S. government could do today that would make the biggest difference for countering Uyghur forced labor, what would it be and why? I don't know, should we go in reverse order or put you on the spot? John?
Might take the answer.
I can't, I don't have enough fingers and toes to come up with
That's right, yeah. Can we give you a top 10? So I think probably the one biggest kind of bucket I would point to is creating the space where industry and government can work together to actually identify the risks within individual supply chains. to define the risk and apply what a particular supply chain visibility, traceability testing solution would be. That's going to give the greatest insight about how to restructure supply chains and address that risk at the earliest stages.
You took my answer. No,
Sorry.
I'm just kidding.
That's great.
No, I think, so, idealistically, I would think that, in someday, if a crystal ball or a magic wand was ever made that could just magically, stamp everything out that was made with forced labor, or identify things that are made with forced labor, that would be great. But I think if we're really truly to kind of get at the whole holistic problem, I think, just as, like you mentioned, John, the sense that if you leverage kind of border policy as a backstop to stopping goods, right? I mean, ultimately, the goods have already been made, right? The forced labor has already occurred. Whether if you're looking in the environmental space for illegal logging, the tree's already been cut down if you stopped it at the border. So I really think it takes a whole of government approach to attack this, whether from, and that's, I think that from the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force and the priority sectors is where we're evolving when we talk about priority sectors, is that it really takes, whether it's the Department of State, Treasury, Commerce, USTR, all address, or AID, all addressing root causes, the problems, the issues, and maximizing pressure on those perpetrators of the forced labor to really affect that problem. So forced labor is not entering into the supply chain, and Department of Labor, I'm remiss not to mention them as well. But to ensure that that forced labor is not entering into the supply chain at all. So, while we really work hard to stop those goods coming in at the outer ports of entry, it really requires a whole agency approach, a whole government approach, both executive and legislative, to work, and industry to work together to really address the broad problem.
Great. Scott?
One?
I mean, if you sneak in a second one, I won't judge that.
Okay. Put Temu on the entity list. Right there, and I mean that would send reverberations through fast fashion in the de minimis world. I think that there is now, with the information, with the reporting coming out of Hong Kong. Jing, if you're watching in Hong Kong, I know it's late there, but the reporting from within Temu about how the company is not a business to consumer platform. It's not at all. It is a online retailer, and it's clear from her reporting that they're doing labeling, shipping, warehousing, and doing sort of helping with sourcing and supplying through their suppliers. And I think that we need to treat them as such and not as an Amazon or an Etsy anymore. I think that would send major reverberations through an industry and through this issue on de minimis. If that can happen, you might get a letter on this issue, I think.
I think we already got a few.
Coming up. But the one other thing I think, and is not in the enforcement area, I think we need to use the sanctions that are there to create an SDN list of the companies and the individuals that are profiting, and then to go after both their sort of positions in the U.S. markets, but also their financial resources. I think that also, it'd be a different type of entity list, but it'd be a treasury, and they would have the ability to sort of cut off funds, for some of these companies and the individuals that are profiting. So I snuck in two. But I think one goes beyond what you gentlemen have sort of worked on, is in terms of the enforcement of trade. There, as you pointed out in your brief, there was also sanctions that were added to the bill, and I think that creating an SDN list specifically for those that are profiting goes after even more the financial incentives, and I think will make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to see just a tranche of sanctions from Treasury on violators of forced labor. Yeah. And you haven't seen that yet. But in the North Korean context, where you have a rebuttable presumption, there have been specific tranches of sanctions for violators of forced labor. And so it would be great to see that replicated. I also, Scott, I did want to piggyback off of your de minimis comment. One of the recommendations in my paper for Hudson was that you would actually create like a bad actors list for repeat violators who are using de minimis to then be banned from using de minimis in the future. So if you have a repeat violator who is using de minimis entry, they would no longer be allowed to use de minimis entry in the future and would be on an actual list that would ban them from doing that. And I think that makes it so that there's like a very specific consequence to those bad actors. And I think, given the select committee's work and others' work on both Shein and Temu, there does seem to be like pretty good evidence for, them not being allowed to use de minimis going forward.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I'm working on an idea which I kind of have called the Strike 3 Act, which would be sort of 3 strikes and you're out type of a thing with the de minimis packages. If you're found to sort of have forced labor in your packaging or in your products that you're sending, you get a warning. Second time, you'd get a significant fine. Third time, you're out, right? You no longer. So I think that idea is still sort of at its, I'm just sort of playing around with it now, but I think that sort of is another way. Since it doesn't look like Congress or the administration are going to close the de minimis loophole. I mean, it's very clear to me, reading the tea leaves, I mean, not even really tea leaves, it looks like Sherrod Brown and Tim Scott, who have a bill, and they're the heads of the Finance Committee. I mean, they seem to be giving up and asking the administration to sort of take action. So, I mean, if that's the case, then I think there's forces that are arrayed against it. So if we're not going to lower that loophole, particularly for foreign adversaries, which seems ridiculous, if we're not going to lower that loophole or eliminate it entirely, then we have to take other action. And so that's kind of my thought process. And so
that's really interesting to hear. Would love to just talk about that more. It sounds very fascinating. I'm going to abuse my moderator's prerogative one other time. There's one other loophole, if you will, that I talk about in my paper in the recommendations that talks about the ability for importers to re-export goods before a determination is made on whether or not it was produced with forced labor. And this, to me, seems like an area where an importer should not be allowed to profit from goods potentially made with Uyghur forced labor. A determination should be made before they would have any sort of option. And if it wasn't made with forced labor, then they could re-export it to another market if they were just frustrated. But I don't think that they should be able to re-export and potentially profit in other contexts. And I think this is I don't know if I would use the word loophole, but is something that importers could take advantage of that I don't think they ought to be able to when you have something as serious as forced labor happening. But I'm sorry, I want to open things up to the audience for questions. Do we have any questions right now? Kelly? Yeah, there's a mic coming.
Also, could I trademark that idea? So if anyone's watching from the Select Committee or from a Senate office, I want to trademark the Strike 3 bill. So that,
you are on the record.
You're not gonna, it's not going to be stolen.
Thanks, Olivia, for convening this. I had a question about, there are already, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation, or the Bingtuan, has been subject to SDN sanctions. It's been a designated entity for almost
2020, July of 2020.
Yeah, we worked really hard because we thought that this would have a huge impact in terms of cutting off a major user at the bottom, that permeates the supply chain for Uyghur forced labor goods and products coming out of East Turkestan. And Treasury has done, there's been very little put behind that designation. So I do have concerns that even, we already have Treasury already has the ability to sanction entities for violations related to human rights. And we did this, it was a big lift on the Bing Tuan, but nothing much has come of it, and they've not listed any of the subsidiaries. They've really not utilized, and nobody has really utilized those authorities, and the fact that the Bing Tuan is on the SDN list to good effect, I think. So that's something that I would like to hear from the panel on, and how we can really push on that, because it is such an important actor. It's really at the center of the whole web of companies and entities that are involved in the forced labor supply chain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I could just maybe start off from there in the sense, I mean, from when those sanctions were put in place by Treasury, but also from us to kind of similar time when we issued our WRO on XPCC and the specific commodities. Certainly, as from our enforcement perspective, and those goods that we are looking at as potential high risk and stopping at our ports of entry are those things related, closely related to the XPCC and the Bing Tuan, and also are those state kind of sponsored affiliated industries and subsidized industries that are potentially manufacturing and then ultimately coming to the United States. So those are things that are being leveraged as far as the enforcement goes for us, as far as goods that we're looking at, but then also the companies and their supply relationships that we equate back to supply chains.
I would just add, I think Treasury is really behind the 8 ball when it comes to both implementing pre-existing sanctions, but also identifying new subsidiaries of XPCC that they also have the authority to go after and have not. Since the Biden administration came in, I think there's been a total of like 3 individuals, a very minimal number. It's in the paper, but it's an extraordinarily minimal number of individuals who have been targeted over Uyghur human rights issues, and it pales in comparison to the previous administration in terms of the number of both individuals and entities that were targeted. For those in the audience who are interested, I know that a letter did go from Congress to Treasury last week from the Senate that was pressing Treasury to provide more explanations on what they're doing and what they have not been doing and why they have not been doing it. So hopefully we'll start to get some answers. And I know that Secretary Yellen has said that it is a priority to target Uyghur forced labor issues, but actions speak a lot louder than words. So I know that's a little tough, but I can do that in my Hudson capacity. So yes, this gentleman in the back.
JP Hogan, I write about politics. I'm confused with the party having profit motive on this, as if the CCP is having some stuff made by slave labor, is that supposed to be more appreciated by the party leader for more pure communism? That if you have something made by slaves, you should wear it more proudly, or are they doing this to sell to markets where there has to be some ethical fashion for the party, that the Uyghur products are either better or worse? So if it's just money, I think if they're going to be the Communist Party and they're going to have slave labor, who is supposed to wear what's made by the slave labor?
Well, you are. You're supposed to wear it, right? I mean, maybe. I mean, I guess I don't understand the question per se, but I mean, I think, I think what we've come to understand is there's a larger goal here, which is to pacify the region. But then there's other interests that are that the party has, because wages have gone up on the East Coast for low-level manufacturing, right? So transferring sort of some manufacturing to the West is in their interest, and so you see a lot of that happening, and it was happening before 2017. But then you have sort of a policy to sort of pacify, re-educate, sort of destroy Uyghur culture, language, and so I mean, I guess it's in their interest, in their larger policy about what they're going to do with the Uyghur population, but then also in their economic interest to sort of transfer and get cheaper labor than they could have in the East Coast because wages had gone up. So, I mean, I guess that's does that answer what you're,
It's like if it's a model example of how to solve things, it seems like there's that conflict in there. If it's made by Uyghurs, is it supposed to be better or worse?
I think that
who is allowed to wear the worse or expected to wear the better?
I think for the CCP, profit is a secondary motive to why they engage in the repression of Uyghurs. Forced labor is a part of a broader effort to subjugate the Uyghur people, to eliminate their culture, to ensure that they conform with the Chinese Communist Party's ideology. So the forced labor programs are an effort, in many ways to separate families. You're sending people to different parts of the country, or you're placing them inside of concentration-like camps. I mean, the primary motive and the reason behind doing this is because the Chinese Communist Party views the people as the primary threat. And as a consequence, they will do whatever they need to do in order to subjugate them. And so I think that's really what's behind all of this.
Sure, but Hugo Boss, came out and said that, high grade sort of Xinjiang cotton is best in the world, right? And so that they were going to continue to use it, and as did about 22 other companies. Hopefully, they're all on the entity list. I haven't checked recently, but 22 other companies that we could find, said the same thing. It's high quality. It's the type of cotton that polysilicate. They dominate the world's polysilicate. And so, sort of mining, and so those inputs, are universal. So, I mean, there is, in the cotton world, I mean, it's Xinjiang cotton. Muji from Japan sort of said Xinjiang cotton is the best. So, we're going to continue to sell it. So, I mean, there's a sense there that, the CCP was pushing the quality of particularly cotton, in the last, 5-6 years.
Yeah, I mean, I've even heard, I mean, just kind of to echo what you all are saying, I mean, again, I think the profit piece, or there is no branding with regards that this is made by Uyghurs, right? So it's, there may be specific items that say, maybe agricultural products that come from the Xinjiang region that could be marketed as saying that these are great. Maybe it's like Xinjiang dates or pears or things, Asian pears or things like, just because they come from the region, and I don't know, maybe they're superior or just because whatever reason. But I think, again, the effort is more nefarious in the sense is trying to eliminate kind of the culture and retrain and kind of make them more into the more prominent, Han or Hui population, kind of integrate them into that. So if you look at a lot of the entities that are being added onto the FLEDF entity list now are really looking at a lot of those where, under the UFLPA, as far as categories go, that where entities can be added to the entity list, is that attribution back to where those labor, whether it's Uyghur, Kyrgyz, or Kazakh or other ethnic minorities, are being transferred. Either they're maybe graduating out of vocational skills and education training camps or prisons, and considered maybe reformed, and then being moved to factories to very prominent labels around in the eastern half of China, doing manufacturing for goods that we're consuming here in the United States. So.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, Anouk?
Thank you so much. My name is Anouk Weir. I work at Hong Kong Watch, and I wanted to ask the panelists for your thoughts on how the UFLPA has influenced or impacted U.S. policy on China. Has it had a dent, or has it shaped the relationship in a new way?
Are you going to take that one? John, how about you?
Sure. So I think, to kind of put this into the broader context of U.S.-China policy is, probably the topic for a long paper. But I would say that I think it's definitely been seen as a data point in terms of concerning labor practices. But I think it's also a sort of a use case, right, in terms of how we continue to do business with Chinese entities, and how that can be done in a responsible way in terms of validating supply chains and understanding where products are coming from. Because obviously the UFLPA does not apply to every product coming out of China, right? So are there concerning practices in this subset? The statute is clear on that point. Does that apply to, say, this is a sort of a decoupling mechanism? It does not. So I think it sort of sets a paradigm in that way where specific concerning practices can be identified and can be dealt with using tools that are either at our disposal or can be created in our current statutory framework.
I mean, it's the first piece of legislation that limited trade with China since 1994, right? Or maybe even earlier. So I think that has an impact. What I haven't heard and what I'd like to hear is for the Chinese side to say, "Hey, stop this. This hurts," right? Because if they're not saying that, then maybe it doesn't hurt enough, right? Right. And so this is my. So I haven't heard this yet from talking to people at China House or in the NSC. I haven't heard that there's been a condition from the Chinese side to say, "Hey, lift this." So obviously they think they can live with it. Obviously they think that it doesn't hurt. And to me, that sort of gets my rage up again, for stricter, implementation. So I mean, I think it has changed because it's limiting trade, and there's a pathway now for doing that, particularly in the area of forced labor. But we've sort of redone that sort of rebuttable presumption sort of notion for cobalt out of the Congo. So the rebuttable presumption idea is also here to stay, and it may sort of be something we can apply to other sort of regions, of China, particularly ones where there is North Korean labor or other industries that we see that. So that it has changed, I think, a little bit, but like I said, I don't know if it hurts enough because they're not asking it for us to sort of to pull back. And so that's where
we'll get there.
Usually those are usually the content of my Zoom calls.
I think it's an additional tool for shifting risk that's important. It's supplementary to things that Treasury can do. I think it demonstrates the fact that you do have the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force that is really, a pretty whole of government approach. It demonstrates that it's not some fringe issue that's relegated to the side of U.S. policy. It's something that engages with many agencies. And so I think it sent a really important signal that for the U.S. government, human rights issues in China they don't have to be peripheral. They can be more central, and not only can they be more central, they can be a strategic move to take. So I agree wholeheartedly with Scott that I would love to see this tool used more aggressively, more comprehensively, and with other complementary measures that come alongside of it. But I really do think that it's shifted conversation about where human rights fit into broader U.S. strategy toward China. So that's a really great question. Thank you for asking.
And I think just to kind of add on top of that, just from my perspective, from the trade foxhole, in the sense that forced labor is incredibly consequential as enforcement is needed to be, right? It's one of many violations, state-level violations that are occurring in the trade space that really create an imbalance with regards to trade and that fair competition globally around the world. So whether it's copyright infringement to health and safety issues to subsidies, evading duties, taxes, and tariffs, right? So all those things are things that is not just forced labor that China is at the heart of being violating, but all those other areas, the copyright infringement, all that are also key things that are being violative, and that is at the crux of creating this fair competition that, from a policy perspective, is we've been pushing to enforce and create policy that helps to level that playing field for domestic industry.
Yeah, and I think it's also created some supply chain shifting, right, from out of China, particularly at the lower end. Milwaukee Tool, who we did a lot of work on because of their prison labor. They've moved manufacturing out, some to the United States, some to Wisconsin, back to Wisconsin at the high end, and some to Cambodia, which may have problems of its own, but in the labor sphere. But they've moved out of. So there's some shifting going on. So I think that's also sort of an important development.
One quick alibi on what Eric mentioned as well in terms of some of the other kind of revenue policy implications, whether duties are being evaded and that sort of thing, that would also be something to talk with Treasury about too, right? They still own customs revenue policy from back when the Customs Service was part of the Department of Treasury. So another topic to chat with our friends at Treasury about. Right?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm cognizant of the time, and I wanted to draw everybody's attention to the fact that we have lunch. If you haven't grabbed it already, I want to give folks time to be able to mingle and to speak with our wonderful panelists who just gave such wonderful insight and a lot of food for thought for all of us to consider. Couple of notes as you go out. One, I don't want my interns to have printed these off in vain. So there's copies of them over there. Please feel free to grab them on your way out. But before we conclude, would you please join me in thanking all of our wonderful panelists?
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Eric.